David, thank you very much for your kind words today. It's a privilege always being on a panel with John as well as this group of goddesses. These are certainly some of the most remarkable women in the state of Connecticut that you can learn from, and I have learned from over the years. Yes, the reason I'm here today is because I'm you. I have been, I came to the Barnum Museum in 1998 as the curator. My background, I have an MA from NYU, spent 3 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and not one class that I had in my graduate program taught me for what I'm living with now. I am the poster child for disaster recovery, mitigation, resilience, and that was never supposed to be on the resume or the obituary, as it were. So, with that, know that your questions are really my questions too. We've thought about how we're going to transform our approaches to funding, particularly going through a major capital project. Not because we've chose to do the capital project at the Barnum Museum because of the tornado and subsequent hurricanes. We were forced into it. So it's not a choice. We have to change. We have to transform. And I had two choices. I could either say, I'm out. Or I say, this place is too important, the history is too important, it's too important to the community, it's too important to our national narrative to let the Barnum Museum go, go into obscurity. So the choice was, yeah, we're gonna get this done, and we're gonna do it in the most 21st century innovative way that's going to speak to the learners today. It's not about my dream for what the museum should be. It's about what the community's needs and their passions are for what a museum should be today. So, which brings us to the question of, how do you fund that? So, with that, David assembled extraordinary panels today, and I'm going to introduce each of you in no particular order. I'm going to go by my computer screen here, and each has got the same formula as last time, about 5 minutes to speak on their particular expertise, and then we're going to change it over, and the first question goes to Shanna over here because I promised her she had a question from before, so everybody knows she's first. So with that, let me introduce Helen Higgins, who right now is the interim director of the Connecticut Humanities. And do you know, Helen, you are in a room of friends. Everybody wants the humanities to survive, so that's an important thing to know, that you got letter writers right in front of you. But Helen, from 1997, was the director of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. And during that period, she led the board of the trust through 5 strategic plans, okay? I couldn't imagine 5. But actually, and in part of what Holly was saying today, Helen did establish the revolving fund, which is now capitalized at $1 million, which is extraordinary. Initially, early on, and I think this is when I met you, Helen, she was leading the Darien Historical Society as the executive director back in 1989, I can't believe it. And then she went to the Highland House Museum in Guilford as the executive director and then as the president. These accomplishments, this work that she did, really led her to her interest in statewide initiatives, and she worked with the Connecticut League of History Organizations and the Connecticut Humanities Council, which it was called back then, and as well as the Connecticut Preservation Action, and that's when we really started working together. I was the newbie when the discussion of the CIA funds, the Community Investment Act funds, were nothing more than a dream. And being around a table with Helen and Bruce Frazier and Anita Mueller, just extraordinary people, Jack Shanahan, that fund was created, and Helen was a part of that, so that was a true privilege. Helen has been the commissioner of Connecticut's commission, has been a commissioner of the Connecticut Commission on Culture and Tourism, a member of the Department of Economic Community Development and Advisory Committee on Culture and Tourism, and she's with us today, and I thank you so much for coming down. Next, let me introduce Rina Bakalar, to my right, your left. Known Rina for a very long time, starting out, currently she's the Director of Economic Community Development for the town of Trumbull and is responsible for supporting the economic vibrancy of Trumbull, ensuring that Trumbull remains a community of choice in Connecticut. It's not a post-road city. you know, like all of the Fairfield County. So there's a different dynamic than Fairfield and Norwalk. So it takes a great mind and innovator to make sure attraction, interest, economic development moves up into the suburbs. But Rina sees arts and culture as a key component of transformational economic development in both suburbs and urban communities. And I can tell you, that's not just words on paper. With Rina, we've been doing that for about 15 years together. So she's walking the walk. This is a real passion of hers. She held senior positions in local, state, federal government, including the director of central grants. And being the director of central grants doesn't really say it all. I think you created the central grants for the city of Bridgeport, which is extraordinary. She's also a former district director for Congressman Shays, if you all remember Congressman Shays. So she was all over the state. She's the former head of workforce development for the state of Connecticut. Her expertise spans economic community development, workforce development, her passion, public policy, which we heard just a little while ago. And she's an extraordinary grant writer and fundraiser, and I've never put a calculator to it, but Rina, I think that in the years we've known each other, you have raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's really true. So she is a force to be reckoned with. Next, let me introduce Juanita James, who's the president and CEO of Fairfield County Community Foundation. She joined the foundation in 2011. She previously served as the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer for Pitney Bowes and held key roles with Time Warner and Bertelsmann Corporations. Juanita is the director of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, the Connecticut Council on Philanthropy, CF Leads, and much more. A trustee of Lesley University and a trustee emerita of Princeton University. She has served as a trustee of the University of Connecticut, director for Reading is Fundamental, which that's dear to my heart. Juanita's long history of leadership has been recognized with the NAACP 100 Most Influential Blacks in Connecticut Award, the Stanford Public Education Fund, Excellence in Education, and the Motley Media Light a Fire, among many others. Juanita holds a master's degree in business from Columbia University Graduate School of Business and a bachelor's from Princeton. So again, we spoke earlier about Kristina not being with us today, and I'm sure you all join me in wishing her well. Her baby's due in just a few weeks, and we're all very excited. But I think Bonnie Koba, sitting over here, found out at about 4 o'clock last night that she'd be pinch hitting for us. And I know Bonnie from being up at the state, too. I'm an appointment to the State Historic Preservation Council. So we see each other once a month when I drag myself up to Hartford at 7 o'clock in the morning for these meetings. But just a little background on Bonnie with the Economic Community Development Office. She's with the Office of Arts and Education. So she is the program manager of the Hot Schools program. Now, working in education, creative programming, and arts learning for over 20 years, Bonnie directs Connecticut's nationally recognized higher order thinking Hot Schools program. Her leadership portfolio at the state, Bonnie has developed and managed Connecticut's Directory of Teaching and Performing Artists, the Connecticut Troubadour program, which I love, Poetry Out Loud artists, schools, and state museum partnerships, and the Connecticut Freedom Trail. The Barnum Museum should be going on the Freedom Trail in the next year or so. And several grant programs, including arts learning, creative placemaking, early learning, underserved youth, creative collaborations, and she's worked closely with the state's 9 regional service organizations. So with that, we've got a wealth of knowledge and experience at this table, and I'm going to encourage everybody to pick their brain. But from that, I will start with Rina. And I've got the time clock too, sorry. That we'll have an opportunity to hear their perspective on the conversation that we're having today, possibly building on some of the things that were said earlier today. There were wonderful insights. And then from there, I'll springboard it with a question. And then what we're going to do, just a little housekeeping, we're going to bring all of the panel speakers up when we're all finished. So we're just going to lift the tables up, move them over, and extend the chairs so you can really ask the full panel. So if you had your opportunity before and you didn't quite get it, we'll be able to ask more questions. So with that, Rina?
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I love being around so many creative people. It feeds my soul. And I want to say to you that my challenges as a director of economic and community development in a town like Trumbull, Connecticut, may be your opportunities. And I think that's the theme of what I want to talk with you about today, because there is an economic imperative to do things differently in Connecticut, to reinvent some of our communities. Trumbull is a bedroom community, a very traditional bedroom community. It's a great community. It is largely residential, and candidly, there's not a lot of there, okay? And that may not be a viable model into the future. People want different experiences, you know this, in their community. They want a sense of experience when they go somewhere. They want social, recreational, business, commercial, and other connections all made in one area. They want dynamic places to walk, to visit, to do their business. Talent, okay? Folks that are coming here to work, that are living in our communities, want to be in those places. So it is essential for communities all across Connecticut, all across the country, but in Connecticut, particularly bedroom communities like Trumbull, to really start thinking about how do we preserve the strong residential character of our town, but yet make it a relevant suburban community for the future. That's in the interest of every resident, of every taxpayer, of every business in town. And it's sort of a story that Connecticut has to figure out. And you all have a big opportunity to infiltrate and to aid and to become a partner in that. And by the way, our corporations have an opportunity to be a part of that, and we should hold them to that, to underscore my earlier point. So I think some of the challenges, the reurbanization for suburbs, people moving back to the urban communities is a great thing, but we're trying to figure out, so what is our suburban appeal over time? You heard recent comments from GE, from other companies, Aetna, they're leaving. They're going where they feel talent wants to be. They're leaving for a lot of reasons potentially, but they want to go where talent wants to be. So how do we create those places? How can you be key to this transformation? So I thought, if I'm you, what's happening in Trumbull, and what could organizations like yourselves be a part of? Because this applies across any community. There are town planning efforts that are going on all the time. There's the State Plan of Conservation and Development is currently in draft. That plan will be a guiding document for town plans. And I don't know how much involvement the cultural community has had in that, but there's an opportunity to comment and to make inroads to talk about community development and economic development, and put yourself into that equation as part of the answer for transforming communities. There's the whole Livable Communities initiative in Connecticut, talking about an aging population in Connecticut. How do people age in place in their community? So what does that mean to you? And I'm going to tell you what it means to you, and I brought you a living resource. This is a grant. It's due June 30th. It's a Livable Communities grant that AARP has out right now that you can apply for. And if you look at this, and I brought some copies for people to take that you might be interested, it's an example of how my problems could be your opportunities, and AARP's problems about getting people to live in place in community, livable communities, could be your opportunity. Here is a grant opportunity from an organization that supports seniors, talking about transforming vacant or underutilized public spaces, public space placemaking, cultural events, holding open streets programs and festivals to encourage people to walk and bike through the community. I'm just reading you a few highlights. You get what I'm saying? They're encouraging stronger sense of place, livable communities, and there's a major opportunity for cultural organizations to be part of that. We have to reinvent our mall space. I don't know if anybody saw 60 Minutes over this weekend. They talked about 30% of malls are going to be closed. It's an economic imperative for communities in Connecticut to transform malls. It's not just Westfield's problem, okay? It is a major taxpayer, if one of the top 10 taxpayers in our town. Now, the Trumbull Mall is doing a little bit better than some of the others, but nevertheless, I'm not going to wait for it not to be doing better, better to start talking with that ownership about how to make that a campus, make it an experience. Where's Angela? Is she in here? Angela came to a recent chamber meeting, and we had the mall folks there talking about your Space Finder piece, and they were very excited. We're doing a whole lot of other conversation and idea trading to think about what's the future of Westfield Mall. And there is a role for cultural institutions in the transformation of properties like that. There is a role for cultural institutions in the transformation of corporate parks, which are an outdated model, most of them in Connecticut. But we will transform. So this is the economic development me, the economic and community development me. I know we need you. I don't always quite know how to put it together, so I'm going to give you a little anecdote. Kathy and I, if you don't know, are dear friends. We happy hour together weekly, I will tell you. So Rina Bakalar is not the most creative person. I might be creative in my ideas, but not in putting, so she can put on an elephant necklace, a yellow dress, pink shoes, a red skirt. She comes in looking fabulous. They would throw a net over me if I came out dressed like that. She just has a way. I need her. I'm very serious about this. I need her. She knows how to infuse that piece into what we're doing, just like a town like Trumbull needs you. So where are we in this equation? Because I'm going to run out of time, and I don't want to do that. I want to say this, that there is, if I'm sitting here, I would, and you have not reached out to the economic community development people, if you have not participated in some of the town planning that's happening, if your community is not talking about placemaking, then push it forward. Get involved. Infuse yourselves. There is going to be money there. I am, as a town, looking to our small town economic development grants that come out every year we're eligible to apply for. Those are capital funds that we can partner with any organization to transform things, to add performance space, to do different things with our trail system that make our community more interesting. And we need partnerships. Now, Trumbull doesn't have a well-coalesced arts and culture scene. We have some wonderful groups and organizations, but there hasn't been a strong force to pull that together. And another one of my challenges is that piece in our town falls under Parks and Recreation. That's not a bad thing. We've got great Parks and Rec people. But I have to figure out mechanically, how do I not, step on toes, but infuse it and bring us all together. So those are some of my internal struggles, but we're going to be reaching out over the next year much more intentionally in our community to coalesce organizations, creative businesses, and that kind of thing on a road to transforming our suburban bedroom community to a community of choice in the future. And I would like to talk to any one of you or all of you who would like to be involved in that process. And I would say watch the trends that are happening in economic development. There will be resources directed to it because it has become an imperative. Okay? Watch what's happening in community development. You will have a role there, whether it's housing development or other things. There is a role for co-locating, making places more interesting, and so forth that you can be a part of. So thank you.
Me next? Okay. Well, actually, I think her message is great. I come to you with two backgrounds today. One is many years in historic preservation, and now I'm the interim director at Connecticut Humanities. But frankly, we've all been in the same world of history, heritage, and preservation for 20 or more years. And I think, looking at who's registered here, many of you are from arts institutions, so you might wonder why I'm sitting here. But I don't know, David, what was the thought? But I think for both in the history heritage world as well as in the arts world, this connection with economic development is so essential to think about how you insert yourself into that community role. And I know many of you are doing this, but boy, that was a very powerful statement. And I will take that back to the history people too. And I think there are people from Norwalk here who understand this beautifully, how they insert. In fact, they get their funding at the Norwalk Museum from the city. And that's a pretty extraordinary thing, a great recognition of how important arts and heritage are to our communities. The Connecticut Humanities, as some of you may or may not know, we had over the past 20 years been receiving I guess we have to call it a line item, from the Connecticut General Assembly of $2 million and more to refund out to the heritage world. In recent years, we've expanded it to include libraries and arts institutions whose projects incorporate humanities themes in them. Last year, at just around this time, we were in the budget for $1.7 million, and we were zeroed out. So we have nothing. We have no funding to give out grants. But I will say what we do have is money, our stipend from, or our grant from the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities. As you probably know, the National Endowment for the Humanities is also being proposed to be eliminated in the Trump budget. So we're kind of getting it at both ends here in Middletown, Connecticut on Main Street. But we don't give up, and I think that when I think about the future of humanities funding in Connecticut, I think less in terms of funding and more in terms of doing. And looking at what you have that exists within your organization and looking in the sort of transition period that I think we're in, at what are those kinds of activities and programs you can do that won't require excessive funding as we sort out the world. And this is what I've been trying to do at Humanities. I've built a budget that has no state funds in it, but we have built a robust program that takes what areas where we had been using people to give out funds, we're now going to put them in the field to provide services to the field. So this is, there's just kind of rethinking how you do your business as government funding. I asked the senator, well, he doesn't know whether we're going to get any funding or not, but the historic preservation funding is at major risk, this Community Investment Act. It may disappear. That will eliminate all preservation funding in the state, because that's essentially where it comes from. The only thing really left would be at the Connecticut Trust. We would have, for some of this make-or-place kind of thing, we do have this revolving loan fund that if you are getting involved in real estate, which isn't a bad thing, you might want to talk to the Connecticut Trust about getting a loan to help with your rehab or your refitting or whatever. I'm not quite sure all that they're doing with that. And we also at the Connecticut Trust have a private funder foundation, 1772 Foundation, for whom we re-grant out to heritage organizations if you're one of those, or you can partner with one of those. But those are for buildings. I want to mention the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is still in business. This budget hasn't gone anywhere. The National Endowment for the Humanities has funding opportunities you can look up on their website, but they're very, and as does the NEA, and I don't know, are you going to talk about the NEA? Okay. But they're all looking at partnerships. So the more that the arts people and the humanities people can partner, the more likely you can go to a big gun like the NEH. They want to give, they have specific lines for smaller organizations. They have specific lines for preservation of materials, which can be arts materials as well as archaeological materials and digital materials. So there's opportunities still out there in the public funding sector, which is the one that I'm most familiar with. So I think I'll stop there.
So, coming a little late to the party, I actually prepared notes, and the panel earlier inspired me to think about ways that a remark that I heard once at a conference is that it doesn't really matter what the question is, the answer is relationships, relationships, relationships. And I think we heard that over and over again today, and I really do think about all of my work from that perspective. And as a representative of the State Arts Agency, which also is in some of the budgets prepared to be zeroed out for this year, as Humanities was last year, we just never know from year to year where we're going to land. And so, as you are, we are constantly rethinking how we do things and what it is that we do. In terms of the NEA, their funding in the federal budget is equal to approximately 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget. And yet, their impact in our communities is so vast and so deep that, you know, we really are trying to take our cue from the NEA and think about how we can use our very limited dollars. We have a very small staff, very limited resources to have the greatest impact also. And so, you know, I think the arts industry and policymakers at nearly all levels have become quite good at collecting, synthesizing, and using data to make a case for the arts, for why the arts matter. In the not too distant past, the argument was about the intrinsic value of the arts. They're part of our culture, part of our heritage, good for kids. There was much to tell about the feel-good nature of the arts. But as economies tightened and public dollars became more competitive, as they are today, we began to look more closely at specific attributes and contributions of the arts on our communities and on our social, environmental, and economic spheres. As we began to uncover some naked truths about the impact of the arts, we began to tie these truths to concrete practices. And it took us a while, but we have in the last decade or so collected evidence to prove the pudding, if you will. Research and data tells us that the arts create jobs and produce tax revenues. They're effective tools in addressing mental, emotional, and physical health and well-being, social justice, reentry, veterans rehab, the list goes on. Central to a community's resiliency, the arts contribute to vibrant cities and help to revitalize rural and depressed areas. They provide essential skills in communication and critical thinking, analyzing, interpreting, creating, imagining, innovation and inquiry, required of a 21st century workforce. We now have longitudinal studies documenting positive impacts such as increased performance on standardized tests, greater self-esteem, increased attendance, decreased behavioral issues, decreased dropout rates for students engaged in the arts, regardless of their demography. And the list goes on. We have the data now, and somehow with a focus on collecting the data, we may have missed some of the poignant stories along the way. I once had a teaching artist say to me, you know, I get that we need to document and assess, but sometimes I just want to make art with the kids. I want to make my own art. And I want to tell the people about the magic that happens when we do that. I think everybody here has had that experience, and that's probably why we're all in this room and why we're so committed in the face of really detrimental budget discussions, both on the state and federal level. So today in this economic arena, every public dollar is a competitive one. And the more globalized our economy becomes, the more tethered we are to one another through technology, the more important cross-sector relationships and our compelling personal stories resulting from those relationships become. The competitive public dollar requires a story backed by facts, and facts backed by story. There should be no dichotomy between the two. And I think whenever you're involved in great grant making and grant applications and considering your work, it is really about having the facts and also having the stories, having, you know, sort of that infinity web of the two. Excuse me. A few years ago at the Office of the Arts, we shifted funding priorities from operational support to project support. And as John said earlier, don't throw anything at me. We actually required authentic partnerships as a scoring criteria for competitive project grants. We saw some really wonderful partnerships emerge or strengthen as a result. But what this also revealed was a broad gap, sometimes in understanding sometimes in desire, and sometimes in capacity for the field to engage in partnerships organically. And fast forward to 2 years ago when Kristina came on board, we set out to do our new Office of the Arts Strategic Plan. And we used human-centered design thinking to do this. And through this process, we commingled a strong mix of likely and not so likely folks to the table to help us reimagine our programs and services. From these charrettes, staff developed a broad vision and mission statement, and we defined a ready lens through which all of our investment decisions will be made. Relevance, equity, access, diversity, and inclusion. Nothing there is new from any of the other panelists' comments. Jobs, social justice, healthcare, community development, education, civic engagement, it's all in there with the arts at the core. Our vision states that we envision a world where the arts in all forms are embedded in everyday life. So far, since creating that vision and the Ready Statement, we have convened with strong support from the NEA focus groups on diversity, workforce development, arts and healing with a focus on the military and veterans. We started an emerging arts internship program matching young artists or students interested in arts administration with arts organizations. We supported emerging and mid-career artists and reinstated the Artist Fellowship Program. We're revamping our education programming and connecting with barbershops and bodega owners to embed the arts in the hearts of our communities. So whether it's pure, high quality, well curated, experiential, or arts and, there's a ton of room for growth in our industry. We talk about the importance of ready, and so when we are considering our funding priorities, we ask, are you ready for investment? And how so? I really believe that the community partnerships are what help you to be ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. Now, in addition to all of my corporate and philanthropic, one of the things that I got very involved in the arts sector when I moved to Stanford 29 years ago. And I've served on the board of the Stanford Museum and Nature Center, including it being its board president. Also served on the board of the Stanford Symphony and on the board of Curtain Call. In addition, Lesley University, for whom I'm a trustee, has the Lunder Art Center, or the Art Institute of Boston was renamed the Lesley College of Art and Design. And arts education and are a critical part of an integral component of Lesley's program. Actually, the expressive therapies program, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels, are really the fastest growing departments in the university. And really linking arts expressive therapy as an integral part of the educational process is a very important part and a very successful part of the growth. Now, my husband and I chose Stanford 29 years ago because of its diversity. Coming from Brooklyn, it was a very important part of our decision, and it was the diversity of its people, its access to arts and culture, and the vibrancy of being in an urban community. So that's in sort of a context of how I'm here today. And I want to talk a little bit about Fairfield County and what we are seeing with respect to funding and funding decisions. So first of all, there's been a real shift in terms of the characterization of the donor. We have accountability. You know, there's a generational shift in how people view philanthropy. The generation of people who believed in giving endowments and leaving money to the community and allowing the organizations and institutions to determine how best to invest those dollars is fading. What we have is a shift. Fairfield County is driven now by financial services, hedge funds, private equity, entrepreneurs. a shift from the manufacturing and the large corporations of old, like Pitney Bowes and Champion and McCall's, and that center changed a lot of the economic profile and underpinnings of their community. And as a result, what we also see are shrinking corporate social responsibility departments, shrinking corporate community relations departments, much more of a focus on cause marketing, and we find those who are investing in community are people who are in the retail sector, people who, law firms, banks, who are working directly with the public and therefore see an importance and understand the importance of investing in local community because they are working with local community. I think the fact that GE got out of the consumer financial business made a big shift as well in terms of their own focus, because once they weren't in consumer lending anymore, that need to interact and relate directly with their consumers and local consumers changed. And we saw their corporate budgets, their corporate contribution budgets reduced by 30–40% before they even made the decision to relocate. So that presents some challenges. The other things we're seeing, now our organization has never relied on state, federal, or any type of municipal funding. It's really, what we do is we connect people who are interested in philanthropic endeavor with the greatest causes. So it's always been about the individuals. But the individuals are asking us for very different types of models. They're looking for a shift away from endowed funds to spendable funds. They want to spend down their giving. They're looking less for, again, discretion at the discretion of the foundation to social impact bonds, to loans, to program-related investments. There's much more of an emphasis on accountability, return on investments. Everyone wants to see measurements and outcomes and return on their investment of their charitable dollars. Actually, charity is becoming a word that's not popular anymore. It's more about social impact investing. Different mindset coming to the table. A lot of people want to bring their business mindset and business practices to philanthropy and to the arts and to the nonprofit sector. Some of that is good in terms of thought and discipline and process. Some of that involves understanding that it is not quite as easy to get a quarterly result, return on your investment, when you're dealing with social change, when you're dealing with creating an appreciation for the arts, and when you're dealing with transforming communities. So how we educate these donors on patient capital, on long-term community investment is part of the challenge that we all face. They're also looking for leverage, for scalability, and for collaborations. Well, scalability presents its own challenges when you're talking about connecting with local community, local residents, empowering and really lifting up and making those connections with your neighborhoods. So you see some tensions in terms of who's in philanthropy now and the models that they're using to grow philanthropy versus the models that have been traditionally used. So those are some of the issues that we're facing. I think they also don't like grants. They like, again, social impact bonds because they feel as though grants are giving things away as opposed to co-investing and looking for a return on that investment. So that needs to influence your thinking about how you approach these donors and how you think about positioning your own outcomes and your own programs. I think Bonnie's absolutely right. You have to have the metrics, but you also have to tell those compelling stories. And those compelling stories need to be about what kind of impact are you really having on and transforming people's lives. The reason our foundation went to really training all nonprofit institutions on results-based accountability is because it is something that resonates with our donors. And whether it's state funding or other grant makers, the whole idea of really being able to talk about what are the outcomes you're seeking, who are you affecting, are people better off because of the work you're doing, is a very important part of that. So if you haven't participated in one of our RBA training workshops, I encourage you to do so. because we are finding that our institutions are getting a wider appeal of grants by being able to really sort of, in some ways, reframe the language and reframe the way they talk about what they're doing. Yes. But I want to say one more point about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think that's a very important part. If we're talking about where are the big themes for big philanthropy, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whether it's the Ford Foundation or Cresby or Wallace, or even local, the Parent Family Foundation, we really have to look at how organizations are looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the challenges we have in Fairfield County is that we have the biggest achievement gap, the biggest opportunity gap, and the biggest income gap in the nation. And I think the arts organizations really need to look at how are we contributing to solving that problem, and what are we demonstrating. And I think we have to look at how can arts be part of that solution, how do you demonstrate that, and how do you demonstrate it in action as well as words. How diverse is your staff? How diverse is your board? How diverse is your donor base? Are you really embracing diversity at all levels, both in action and in words? And I think that's some of the thinking we have to think about going forward if we're really going to attract donors from every sector.
Thank you so much, everybody at the table. This is just a wealth of information. I saw a lot of people jotting notes down, so that means there's success there. But Juanita's comments, I think, really leads us to one of the first questions. With the Fairfield County Community Foundation grants and looking at the metrics that we need to provide, arts organizations don't always fit into these statistical documents. I mean, Bonnie was talking about magic. How do you put a percentage figure to something that's magical years down the road? It's not really designed for arts and cultural organizations. They certainly look much more like social service organizations where you can create that data. So I think a number of folks here who've related this would be interested in working with the Fairfield County Community Foundation to make more plausible metrics that can be measured by arts organizations, because it puts us at a disadvantage. And paying $50 to go to one of those programs is not always okay. So it's almost, you're at a disadvantage if you don't have enough staff or funding to actually go to that Fairfield County Foundation program, and then you won't have a successful grant if you can't. So it's a little bit interesting that way, but the real question based on that is, I think, how do we all of our organizations and our leadership really approach this shift in traditional thinking as far as fundraising goes and aggressively redirect our old models of fundraising? Building on that question, we need to engage in a new kind of confidence building for ourselves personally. We have to change that mind frame, individually, but as well with our organizations. It's scary, and somebody said it earlier today, we don't like change. I think it was Tony, we don't like change. So we have to make that shift down unexplored paths. So do we even have a choice, with the bottom line? So the question, this first question, is about how can we have enough courage and confidence to step up to Rina when she says, let's figure out what we can do as far as economic development and make our organizations more attractive to the potential donor. So if anybody could speak to those.
So actually, I think that a couple of misperceptions. If you were at the Cultural Alliance ACES Award event last week, you would have heard James Norton had a wealth of statistics about those metrics and how the arts actually contribute both to the health of society as well as the economic growth. And there are organizations that do that research quite well, and the Cultural Alliance is a terrific resource in terms of helping provide you with those kinds of metrics. Secondly, the workshops are only $15, so they're not unaffordable. But my point is, working with some of the metrics that Bonnie quoted and some of the work that Cultural Alliance is doing, you can have that discipline of being able to gather those kinds of metrics and data But you have to make a conscious effort to say, this is something that I've got to devote some percentage of my 1 or 2 person staff time to, but it may enable me to gain more resources in order to do more of the creative work that we're trying to do.
It was $50. We signed for it. It was $50.
And
So
it depends on which one, right?
But anybody else would like to speak to that before we open it up?
So I just wanted to say that one of the things that I think is really tough to not do is to sort of sell yourself short in terms of your work, your vision, your plan, in order to fit the needs of a specific grant, but rather to spend the time looking for a grant that supports your specific needs or an opportunity. And I love the comment that my problems could be your opportunities. And I'm going to steal that if you don't mind. But I think really, you know, if we think about it, that's really what the national trend is, and it's what the state trend is, and it's what the local trend is, and that's what Senator Hwang talked about earlier, is that, you know, while the importance of high-quality arts needs to be upfront and personal, right, and needs to keep that place at the table, it's also the arts and piece that gets us those stories. So I know Angie Durrell is here somewhere, and she has had magnificent successes with the kids in her community. I don't know if you've gone to one of her concerts, but if you haven't, there is an incredible mix of people at a concert that is by children and by adults of many different ethnicities. And it's not all the people that look like me that are at the concert. And you don't see that in a lot of organizations. So the inspiration that's happening for those kids and for those adults who attend and the parents of those kids, you don't know where those funders are in that audience until you sit in it and you start to make those connections. And so that magic happens. It's a matter of finding the dollars that are going to support your magic rather than making the magic to support the dollars. And I think that's the trap we fall into.
If I could dream for a little bit, I would ask folks, and I know it's a difficult funding environment in Hartford, but there are lots of dollars that are talking about how to bring business growth to the community. And I would dream about a program or an effort that would infuse some capital to take, and I'm going to go back to something I said, malls, corporate parks, and look at a transformation for the future of those areas to be much more attractive to dynamic business growth in our state. And I would do it with an emphasis on engagement of the culture and arts organizations with local economic and community development people, and we would come together and really look community by community about how to transform those spaces into a more modern model. And that would be driving at what they are driving at up in Hartford in DECD as I see it. How do we get businesses to take up the space? If you looked at the vacancy rates for offices in Connecticut, it is extremely high. The kinds of buildings that you see are nothing that is going to be easily transformed in a lot of respects going into the future. So we need to look at this. This is major. We are a property tax-driven state at the local level. So there is an economic imperative. It is coming. My father said this, and you've heard me, you can borrow this one too if you like it. My father used to say to me, Rina, when you're 1 tick ahead of people, you're a genius. When you're 2 ticks ahead of people, you're a lunatic. So I am capable of being on the fringe of a lunatic at times, Juanita, right? In some of our work, we've been there, you know. And so I say this to you, this is coming. And if we could work together, it'd be a tremendous opportunity for arts and culture organizations and local communities to do so, and developers and landowners and businesses to come together and really do that. Connecticut could be a model in how to make these kinds of transformations. We're small enough to do it, but it takes creative thinking, it takes some guts, it takes some change, it takes redirecting some of the dollars. You know, I've got ideas about where we can take it from. A lot of this stuff can go on even the capital side of the budget, right? Not that, you know, I know that's a big controversial thing too, but they're putting it all over in all kinds of other things that I don't think have the lasting transformational effect. This is my opinion, and that we need. And so why not do something like that? Why not be bold? Could we come out of this kind of a session with a bold suggestion like that we start to bring forward? I don't know. Could we? I'm willing to work on it.
I just want to add, at the Connecticut Trust, we've just surveyed mills in Connecticut, historic mills in Connecticut, many of which, or the majority of which, the historic ones are underused, underutilized. They have brownfields and so on. DECD does have money for them. There are some interesting ideas out there regionally about artists, communities coming together to reuse these places as maker places. And one of the more interesting ones that can't seem to to get off the ground is the Gilbert and Bennett factory in Reading that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Jane Philbrick has sort of been leading the charge on that. But, you know, it may never get off the ground. It's got so many financial problems. But there are some very interesting ideas that they have about how that space gets used, where you can, and also the ball and socket factory in Cheshire is another one, where they're using spaces to bring artists in, have after-school programs for children, have the little gardens and so on and so forth. There are opportunities to look at, as you're saying, the reuse of buildings. I'm pitching historic. You're pitching. You're pitching those malls that were never part of community anyway. Sorry, but But just for all of you, in the arts and history world here, there are a lot of opportunities, again, as I said earlier, to look at real estate as a way to get into the funders and, building communities around old real estate.
So if I can clarify, I'm not, the reuse is key, that's one piece of it, but I'm talking about using the creative talent to reinvent the actual spaces, the campuses, the total picture as well.
So with that, we had asked members to submit questions ahead of time, so instead of me reading them again, let me turn that mic over. So Steve, I think you should ask your question, and then Shannon, if we can jump over.
Juanita, I run WPKN Radio, which is a community radio station nonprofit. And we don't always fit into the easy pull-down menu for grants. And based on what I'm hearing today about individual support being paramount these days as opposed to government support, I'm wondering how we could be more proactive as a nonprofit to find out a little bit more about some of the family-directed funds that you have as part of the foundation.
So first of all, I think that WPKN has been really tremendous in doing much more exposure about a lot of community events. I've been on your station a number of times. I hear a lot. So you've done tremendous outreach to community. I think it's important for all of these arts organizations to engage their boards, right? So when you hear WPKN and they are interviewing you, let your board members know. Get your board members more involved as ambassadors, because it's the board members who actually have the funding resources. So to the extent that your organizations and all of the community groups that you're supporting understand the work that you're doing in terms of outreach, then they need to also get their boards to, introduce them to the work you're doing and to support the work you're doing. So again, this big part of board fundraising isn't so much about getting the boards to do the ask. It's about getting your boards to be better ambassadors for your organizations so that they understand where you're getting your support and your partnerships. I think that's one way to really do that. Because most donors do not like to be approached, right? So many of them will give anonymously because they don't want people approaching them, and therefore you've got to do it with an existing relationship.
Good, thank you.
Good morning. So I think my question's been indirectly answered, but I'll still put it out there. It's two, both in the realm of giving. And the one is and I imagine it's the same as if you're a corporation, but where does the individual artist stand in the position of giving, right? So where do patrons exist? Where does the room for you to create and be funded exist, or does it anymore unless you're tied to something bigger than yourself? And my second part is, so I'm from Bridgeport, and there's a dialogue around Bridgeport that says, well, Bridgeport has nothing, or you hear something bad, and you're like, well, it's Bridgeport. And so I find a lot of times when you're looking for funding and resources, people look down on the city as opposed to seeing it. And it's really hard when you're part of a renaissance, which is what exists in that place, right? There's incredible, talented artists, but so many times you hear Bridgeport, and then that's the deal breaker, you know? And it's unfortunate because, like right now I'm working on this little Liberia project, which you're very familiar about, and we're trying to preserve the history of Bridgeport with the Underground Railroad. The water at Seaside Park is the Underground Railroad. Nobody knows this, right? And so we're fighting to have this seen, and at the same time, we're fighting people trying to get rid of the last two standing houses, which is your historical society might know a lot about. And so how do you face those kind of challenges? You're not even facing challenges, you're facing an opinion. So it's like an invisible thing that you're fighting. And how do you get beyond that for people to see? And I find a lot of times that people bring business into the city and they reach outside of the city to support the businesses. But Bridgeport is a place founded on family. Everybody has a cousin somewhere in the room, you know? And so instead of sustaining the community through the community, they're looking for other people. But there's so many people there. So how do you get beyond the impositions of judgment when you're trying to create or preserve the history that's existing there already?
So I'd like to answer part of that question. I think that there's a real opportunity for all of the arts institutions and cultural institutions in Bridgeport to get together to tell the story. Because I don't think any one organization has the marketing dollars to really tell that story. But if you pool your resources and again get your boards and your supporters and say, we want to tell the story about the creative renaissance that is happening in Bridgeport, you know, it really has to be a collective effort. And then I think you would actually get funders who are interested in doing that. We have arts funds that are specifically devoted to Bridgeport. But as a community foundation, we cannot support individuals. We are, from a tax standpoint, not allowed to give to individuals. We can give to organizations and institutions, but not to individuals. But I think if you can get people together to form a collaborative and say, let's tell this story of the Bridgeport Renaissance together, you might find other funders who are willing to support something like that.
I want to speak to that from a different perspective. So I have a long history. I'm from Bridgeport also, and I've done a lot of my work in that community. And going up to Trumbull last year, they were a client of mine in a consulting practice part-time, but I went there full-time last April. And it's really interesting what I'm seeing happen with the suburban relationships to the urban communities. Attitudes are starting to change to the positive. Reurbanization is changing the way things that plays out, I think, over time, I hope, to the positive. And I'm going to give you a concrete example. At one point, homes in the part of Trumbull that were near our mall, actually, which borders Bridgeport, that whole area, you know, when you come up Main Street, you're familiar. I'm sorry if I'm talking out of school and you don't know where I'm talking about, but you know what I'm talking about. They didn't sell very well. That was a tough place to sell a Trumbull home. I'm going to tell you, those houses are selling at a much higher rate. It is much more of an in-demand area because the coolness of being near an urban community, being near transit, and other walkable shops and amenities is becoming more interesting, more in demand. I don't know how to say it any differently. And so things are starting to change, and I'm starting to hear it. There's still those issues, you know, those perception issues. But I think that, you know, more real conversations about the regional assets and how the suburban communities and the urban communities can share excitement about our assets, our artists, and all that, I think is going to help bring that forward. But there is a transformation happening, I think, a little bit.
So with that, are our morning speakers here?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions.
Well, want to bring everybody up? Okay. Yeah, so the other speakers, if you're still kind of...
While we're rearranging, I also want to let you know, Shanna, that we have artist fellowships available for individual artists. We also have artists can apply to our project grants and to our Reggie grants. So there are some opportunities, they're more limited, but I think that the other thing is to go back to what it is that the outcome will be, and to be able to express your work through an outcome if that is the grant that you're seeking.
Hello, my name is Barbara Alexander with Arts in Connecticut, and we are an employment agency for artists. But to go back over here, Ms. Bonnie, you were talking about some statistics earlier, and I wanted to know where can we get those statistics. That went for a grant that I was working on. So if you would please let us know where that is.
Sure.
And I got one more, hold on. And then my second question was, as now we're one now. Many of the grants, though, that we have been looking into, you have to be 3 years and older. So please let us know how we can secure more grants, because we're still trying to get these grants. We are looking for sponsors in order for us to continue to help these 1,000 artists as we create and customize programs for artists throughout the state. So what can we do?
So I think second question first is that, at least for us, there has to be a floor of experience and success in order to invest state dollars. There are taxpayer dollars, and so we are looking for that, which is why we look at the 3-year, the 3-year bottom. However, I will tell you from working in schools, when we bring in a new program or a new idea, often what happens is after 3 years, the educators who are the cheerleaders of a project hit the wall. And so there's no guarantee that something that's 3 years is going to be successful, but that's sort of what we've been using as our measurement. The information that I gave you, there's such great information out there. Americans for the Arts, and I'll show you the booklet after I hand over the microphone, has a website. They have published materials. The NEA has a website and published materials. There's all kinds of resources where you can find exactly those kinds of statistics. The Americans for the Arts booklet really breaks it down in a variety of ways. So education, community, state and local funding, all different iterations. But the facts are the facts, and they've been collected across the nation over a long period of time. And there's a lot of, I'm sure that you folks have independent studies that you have done in some way. You don't? Okay. So I know we have some studies that we've done, but the information is out there and available. Just sort of Google your question and you'll get some answers. But those two websites are particularly good.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angelica Durrell from the Intake Music Organization. I have two questions per se. One is, what are the funders doing collectively, or what could we do collectively to make sure that all the organizations truly address and understand the aspect of inclusion and diversity that goes beyond having a person of color on your board, having a person of color on your staff, having a person of color in your audiences. So how can we work to really bring that cultural competency and diversity awareness into our program and into our organizations? That's one of the goals that I have. And the other is, from a funder's perspective, in terms of funding an organization that's young, that may have 3 years or more of existence, if we're working on, underserved, disenfranchised communities, different demographics that are not legacy institutions per se, that get all the bucks and have all the line items, how can you support these organizations, or what are your plans to support the infrastructure of these emerging innovative organizations?
Okay, so two parts to that question. I think this question of cultural competency is one that is going to continue to come up. Don't forget, it depends on what your organization is. The state has certain things that govern it. When you have donors, it's the donors that drive what the level of interest is and what their level of interest is and what they want to participate in. So it's really about, I think the earlier panel was very good when they said, you've got to build those relationships and get donors to come to see what you're doing, to want to engage, because just trying to approach it from you need to be better educated in terms of cultural competency is not a strategy that's going to work. A donor has to get excited about the work you're doing, and then they have to be your brand ambassadors to spread the word about what you're doing, and to build, that has to be a bottom-up kind of thing. So I think that's really what the response is. I don't know if Holly or you want to?
There's a whole cultural kind of background, and again, it depends what kind of organization you are. In the museum world, this has been a conversation for 40 years of how do you achieve diversity in staff and boards, being exactly what Juanita just said. It is a fact that very few people of color go into the world of art history. It is a cultural fact that exposure to that whole world and field much earlier on in your life has to occur to create people in the labor force. I mean, it's a very big, long, complicated issue. And after listening to this for years myself, I decided that what everyone could really do immediately was to mentor 3 people themselves. And that if every single museum director and senior staff member did that, we would get more people coming into the workforce. And actually that kind of worked in its limited way, but how do you change a culture where people see that as a real opportunity for a job? It is a very complicated issue, and it's in the gallery world, it's everywhere, in the visual arts end of it. Not so much for artists, but for people who are going into that profession, and that's true of many professions. Anyway, lots of information on that if you're interested, but you're not bringing this up as a new challenge. I think Juanita is very correct that a number of bigger organizations are now really looking at it in a different way.
I just wanted to say, too, that, we tend to have great ideas about what everybody else needs. And we tend to go out and make a plan to address those needs without asking everybody what they need. And I think that when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, I can't sit back in my castle in Hartford and decide that I know what's right for Fairfield County. For Bridgeport, for Trumbull is going to be different than what is going to happen in Fairfield, right? And so it's important to go to the community you serve and you work with to determine the path to serve that community. So creating an idea or coming up with my idea doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right one. And I think when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, we're really thinking about, that's why we're looking at the barbershops and the bodegas. We're looking at where do people go that are not already at the table. It's not that they don't have the intellectual capacity or the creative spirit or the emotional drive. It's that they haven't been invited to the table. When we say, you know, here's an opportunity, they don't say, oh, that means me. They say, oh, that's an opportunity for somebody. And so how do we turn that, how do we turn that thinking around? And I really believe the only way to do it is to go into the communities and ask. When we started our strategic planning this year, we had legislators at the table, we had entrepreneurs at the table, we had barbershop owners at the table, and we had arts organizations, we had cultural leaders, we had all kinds of folks from everywhere at the table saying, okay, here's what we see that you do for us, and here's where the missing links are. Here's what we would like to see. And that's how this flyer is out there. It's just a one-pager out of our strategic plan. But that's where the idea of READY came from. And we have made a concerted effort in our office to really focus all of our investments on that lens, right? And I guess I'll just stop there, because I could just go on this one.
Hi, I'm Amber Valangas. I'm with the Brookfield Craft Center in Brookfield, Connecticut. And I just had a question around, and I think that probably a lot of organizations can relate to this challenge around the idea of collaboration and synergies. And we all know that we can make more impact together. I mean, this is something that it seems like such a no-brainer, and that funders want to see, and so on and so forth. But we have our challenges because we're small organizations. So trying to pull together collaborations and trying to have the time to do that, and this applies to reporting as well. It's not that we don't want to collect these things or we don't want to collaborate. It's just that our air conditioner is broken, and we've got 20 kids coming to our organization for a program, and we hope the instructor is going to be there. So these are the challenges. What strategies would you recommend to kind of alleviate some of those challenges so that collaboration can happen? And is there funding out there to assist with those types of collaborations?
I just thinking, what you need is sort of a stimulant to get groups together who are looking for projects to collaborate around. It's sort of like you have this, but this doesn't result in anything. I mean, I don't mean it negatively, but it doesn't result in an action or. And it's kind of something that we've been thinking about at Connecticut Humanities is convening. I know you're all going to die when you hear this. Convening people around the fact that next year is the 200th anniversary of the Constitution of 1818. Well, there is a world out there that loves that stuff, okay? So we literally are bringing right now, maybe 15 organizations together to talk about what kinds of programming we all would like, and my dream is out of these conversations, collaborative programming will emerge. So what we're really taking is a theme and bringing people together and kind of saying, how can we work together? And I don't know, it's just a strategy that I thought about.
And I wanted to say, too, that, so I brought a bunch of principals to a museum. Some had never been to a museum before. These are principals of our K-12 schools. All right. For some it was common practice. They've been to many museums. Others have not. So we in the arts, I think, often assume that everybody understands our language, everybody shares our passion, and everybody has had the experiences we have had. Wrong. I'm just going to say wrong, to quote Trump. We'll quote him once today. But I think that the idea for collaboration is to think about, so the arts really embody the opportunity to have cultural discourse, right? I mean, the idea that the Shakespeare in the Park project today is been defunded by, I think it was Delta and one of the major banks because of the Bank of America. So the idea of why that happened, you know that is the best advertising that project is ever going to get. Okay, so the idea that the arts sometimes make people uncomfortable, these conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion, these can make you really uncomfortable on both sides of the aisle. But the idea is to begin to understand how what was it? You know, my problem is your opportunity, and your problem is my opportunity. And to bring those ideas together through a collaborative practice. Because at the end of the day, what is it that we all want? We want communities that are vibrant and engaging. We want places where our kids can go to school in a safe environment. We want a place where when we become old, people are going to be nice to us and take care of us well. I'm training my kids now, and I'm even starting to work on my grandchildren. But you know, I mean, those are the things that we all want. And how do the arts help get us there? And I think that when we're talking about what some of the stats and some of the research are, you know, revitalize rural and depressed areas, provide essential communication skills, help to analyze, to be analytic, to be creative, to be innovative. Those are skills the arts produce. So for a community to find ways to collaborate and have discourse around topics about that community and what's right for the community is the biggest bang for your buck, and it generally is going to cost you a box of Joe at Dunkin' Donuts, you know.
So we're at 12:42. Do we have time for one more question, or do we want to wrap?
Everybody willing for set for one more? Remember your evaluations, please, if you leave early.
Mine isn't really a question, but more of a comment. In terms of collaborations, we in Stanford find that collaborations are pretty darn easy, and when you say that funding is based on relationships, we find that collaborations are also based mainly on relationships. We do a good job of it because we at Project Music, Marty Etter's Ballet School, Curtain Call, Loft Artists Association, we regularly get together to meet and talk about how can we best collaborate. So an arts organization like ours, which is mainly a social program masquerading as an arts program, as an El Sistema program, where we serve the underprivileged children in an intensive program, we look to give them the opportunities of participating in a curtain call production or in a ballet school production where they would not ordinarily be. So those things are organic. I think when you go seeking collaborations, they don't necessarily come out so well. But if you just look around you and network amongst your own community and where do you spend your time and with whom do you share ideas, those are the natural organic collaborations that work the best. So I think, all right, I'll bring it home if you don't mind. I think collaboration is a key word here, and I agree. I've enjoyed collaborating since I started before it was fashionable back in the late 1980s, dare I say. But to Juanita's point, also, I'm happy to tell you that Bridgeport, the organizations, Little Liberia, even the zoo, we've all committed to collaborating because it's all about storytelling. Whether it's storytelling for a state grant or a foundation grant, we do have a story to tell. Our own unique, ideas or places are important, and I always say all boats rise with the tide. So as we're working with the zoo, the better they do, the better I'm going to do, and as the Barnum Museum re-envisions itself, we're not going to take the museum down this 21st century path without making sure that our Freeman houses, which were part of the historic story, but are part of our modern story. So we'll come into the foundation for an application that we could find a way to make sure that we map out not just a visit to the museum, but a visit to Bridgeport. We're an attraction. We are an economic, I'm not even using we're a museum visit. We are an economic impact visit on an attractions level, and we can feed the economy. We can enrich the lives of the people, not just in Bridgeport, but in the state. But it is all about collaborations, and they are doable. Yes, I know they're challenging, but you know what? What's not challenging? So to jump in, be courageous enough to jump in and explore those threads that bind the stories to make sure that we're fulfilling our obligations and our missions. And Mike earlier said, you know, we're a place of intellectual exchange and community engagement. And that's where you succeed, when you do become the heart and soul of your community and the broader picture. So
there's one thing I'd like to say about collaboration, which is that it's a word that means different things to different people. The challenge, in fact, is not to collaborate. The challenge is to go it on your own, because that's not going to work, right? And what collaboration means to most people that I've worked with over the years is some transactional relationship where we get together and we move all the chairs from this side of the room to that side of the room, and then I don't see you anymore. What real collaboration is, and what we're being asked to do, because the word 21st century has been thrown around a couple of times as well, that is our emerging future, but it's still emerging. It's fragile. It's up to us to get to innovative, and I don't want to call them solutions, because we're not solving problems. We are setting directions. It's all we need to do, I believe. And so collaboration should be a transformative relationship changer when we're working together in ways that are deep, where we trust one another, where we let our creativity lead, and we do new things together that I wouldn't have thought of by myself, but working with you and others in the community, everything that we do needs to be co-creative. I have a lot of good ideas, but they're much better when there's a diverse group of people working with me and we are co-creative.